Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the engineering side of data. I have a familiar face joining me again today. So this is Johnny Chivers, and we're going to be talking about AWS Glue, specifically the serverless ETL aspect of it. Welcome, Johnny. Thanks for coming on. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, so this is my second time actually on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to this episode. Most of you probably know me from my YouTube channel under my name, Johnny Chivers, where I put up a lot of like AWS orientated videos towards the data side of AWS. A lot of stuff on Glue actually, which is possibly why Bob asked me back on this podcast, hopefully. And then I also run the website, www.johnnychivers.co.uk, where again, I put up loads of learning resources for AWS. And since the last time I was on the podcast, I've become an AWS Community Builder, which is a program by AWS that they put non-AWS employees into who are doing good work throughout the community to kind of share their knowledge and learning experiences. So that's what I've been up to since the last time I was on, almost a year ago, I think it was now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, about a year ago. Wow, time flies. And congratulations on the Community Builder appointment. That's big news.
Yeah,
very
thanks
exciting.
very much. Thank you.
Yeah, so Glue. Yeah, this is something that I knew that you've had some experience in based on some prior discussions. I'm actually starting to get my feet wet. I did have a small project back in 2019 that involved Glue, but didn't really get to dive into it too much. But I'd say that since the beginning of the year, been living the Glue life. Definitely been doing more with it, getting to experience some of the good stuff and some of the not so good stuff. So we're going to cover some of the features all in depth today. So let's kick it off. When people ask you, what is Glue, Johnny, what do you tell them?
A gateway into a better life. But in all seriousness, for me, I kind of go with the definition. It's a one-stop shop of a serverless ETL platform, and that includes cataloging, the running of jobs, and even the scheduling of those jobs, if you want to go that far, inside the AWS ecosystem itself.
Gotcha. Yep. Yeah, that's I would say that's a really good description of that. So why don't we start off on an optimistic note here? And what do you like about Glue?
So for me personally, the thing that I like the most about it is the lower barrier to entry it presents overall. Because it's serverless and a fully managed service from AWS, it removes the barrier that you need a skilled DevOps engineer to operate on the ecosystem of big data. In this case, we're mainly talking about Spark. So you're going to get in behind the scenes, abstracted to you, access to a Spark ETL engine running on a multi-clustered computing system. But you don't need to have an in-depth knowledge of how to configure that multi-clustered system. Spark knowledge does help, but when you're starting out, it means that you don't have to have a lot of it, or you can start with none and gain that knowledge as you go. And then it allows you to kind of scale up both your ecosystem and your knowledge base at the same time. I also like the fact that it uses PySpark. You have the option of PySpark or Scala. I personally don't touch Scala. Not that I'm not a fan of Scala. I just always implement PySpark because Python's now, I think, the #1 computer language in the world. And because it takes PySpark, you've lowered that barrier to entry again and actually training people on that ecosystem, which I've been doing for the last year in my current job. And then I think the last thing that I really, really like about it is actually the data catalog side of Glue. The data catalog is where you catalog, as it says, all your different data sources, be that on S3 or an RDS system or even a data warehouse somewhere. And I've came from a background where we talked in the last podcast of using the likes of a Hive metadata catalog and things like that. And I think the Glue data catalog simplifies that again. And then it integrates out of the box with the Glue jobs, which we're going to talk more about during this podcast, making that whole ecosystem really simple and flexible to use. What about you, Bob? What do you find with your more recent experience that you've kind of gone into Glue? What do you like about it on the optimistic side?
Yeah, I would echo your first comment there about it putting a friendly face on an otherwise it's trickier distributed computing platform, right? Even with EMR, and EMR simplifies things quite a bit. So I think that Glue being serverless is easier to work with than EMR traditionally, and even much more so than an on-prem Spark cluster or something else. I also like the fact that obviously with Spark, you get PySpark. I think that's a big win. Python is obviously very approachable, has become very popular in the data engineering space, much to my surprise. I never thought I'd see that happen. It wasn't too long ago when you wouldn't be developing data engineering functionality in Python, but lo and behold, here we are. At least that's my opinion. Yeah, very flexible. Some of the I guess I call more of the wizard-like functionality where you can say, I want to pull from this source, so I'm going to go to this target. That's kind of a nice add for, to kind of ease you into it. But yeah, definitely the serverless aspect is above and beyond my favorite part of Glue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly for me, I had a data engineer under me who was a graduate, Python background in university, but no experience in the professional world using any sort of distributed system for doing data engineering at all, and had never encountered the likes of Spark or any other kind of like Hadoop sort of engine for that, be that Presto or old things like Pig and MapReduce. And he got up and running maybe within a few weeks of ground zero of nothing to creating his own ETL jobs using Glue and running big data through them. Now, interestingly, speaking to him about that, in one sense, it was a blessing where it was like, this is simple. We don't need a DevOps engineer. But what I did find on a slight negative of that, and I think something the listeners should be aware of, is that when he got stuck and the error messages inside Glue or Java error messages that get printed out either in the CloudWatch or whatever kind of system you're using to gather those, he did struggle with that because having not been in a Java setup or a more kind of like bare metal kind of distributed system, it was like, what are these error messages throwing about tasks, nodes, and runners and things like that? So I definitely think it gets them up to someone like him up to speed a lot more quicker and making it. But you've always got to bear in mind that at some point you're going to need to gather that distributed knowledge of how those systems actually work, even though there is a kind of veil placed in front of you with Glue. Yeah,
very good point. Yeah, you can get started, but know that at some point that additional knowledge will be helpful when you pop open those logs and see all that very confusing verbiage. So, excellent. Yeah, so a lot to like about Glue. So what don't we like about Glue?
I think the list of what we don't like about it is almost as long sometimes as the things that you do like about a system, but that's just the nature of kind of distributed computing, I think, regardless of your background at time. So for me personally, I have struggled a lot with cross-account CI/CD. And I don't mean struggled as in not being able to get it working. It's a very involved and technical process that, depending on what your ecosystem is, involves you as the architect or solutions engineer developing your own system for it. There's no AWS recommended best practice for cross-account at the moment. If you're running two accounts, dev and prod, it's really up to you as the engineers or the DevOps team to come up with a solution of how you're going to promote jobs from one account to the other account. And there's a couple of nuances with that as well. Glue still requires all your scripts to be kept in an S3 bucket. So no matter how you're going to do your cross-account CI/CD, so cross continuous integration and continuous delivery, you're going to have to come up with a methodology that copies your scripts between two accounts, probably with some sort of source control in the middle, which usually, or these days, is all Git. If anyone's still using some version of like Subversion or something, please stop listening to the podcast immediately and go update and go to Git. So I think we're all using some version of Git these days. place that I last implemented this over the last 12 months, we were using Bitbucket. So we ended up using Bitbucket pipelines and a series of kind of get actions on commits to start copying our scripts between our S3 buckets. Of course, that's a big cross-account copy happening and giving keys into Bitbucket and then running it that way. And then it does bring in the ability to have slight mishaps, because now you're relying on developers committing and making sure that the commits are done correctly, or else they might commit to the wrong branch. And then you might actually end up populating your script up to production and putting in a whole lot of source control checks yourself. Probably not that bad or not that big a deal if you've got a very, very well embedded DevOps team, especially at enterprise level, who know exactly what they're doing. But if you're in a startup or a small team of data engineers, it is a daunting process to set up and will take weeks, at least weeks, if you know what you're doing, in my case sometimes. And the first time I did it, it took me a couple of months to get it in. And I know, Bob, you've been kind of doing the same thing recently yourself.
Yeah, I think definitely not as far down the path as yourself and your team, but headed down similar territories, utilizing our Bitbucket, in this case is GitHub, utilizing GitHub Actions, and managing the pipeline that way. And I would also agree with your sentiment about there's not a lot of guidance out there, from AWS or anybody else for that matter, that says, hey, this is how you should set up your DevOps pipeline. And obviously no built-in tools to help that, right? There's, I think with Azure ADF, so Azure Data Factory, for example, they have some nice Git integration, some nice promotional tools that are built inside the actual product themselves that make things a little easier from time to time. So just know that, like as Johnny stated, that if you're going to want to take Glue to production, which is, I imagine, the goal for the majority of the folks, is that you're going to be building up this pipeline with little to no guidance yourself. So, yep.
Yeah, which is good for me and you, Bob, with our knowledge. Obviously, if anyone wants to contact us, we can help out, share our knowledge, or of course you can always employ us on our contract basis on 1099s to come help as well.
There you go. Now we're talking.
Now we're talking. Yeah, I think the Azure is a good point. And again, this is my kind of personal feeling between the two. I feel Azure is a lot more mature as a kind of like holistic system for data engineering with GUIs, and a lot less for the actual engineers to worry about, other than maybe like clicking and dragging, kind of the way that SSIS is for Microsoft, or Informatica have their own tools, or insert other kind of click and drag ETL tools here that have been used on premise for absolute donkeys that we all know and we've all saw. And that's definitely where Microsoft have took their on-premise knowledge and built a cloud solution that reflects the skill sets that people might have for coming on-premise. Where Glue falls down at the moment is probably that level of GUI kind of click and drag functionality that exists in Azure. It's definitely coming with the Glue Studio around jobs, where now you've got nodes and you can enter it. But I do feel that was deliberate initially, where Glue does give you the ability, and this is how I do it, and the data engineers that I work with do it, where we just script from start to finish. So we're in complete control of everything going on. We're not reliant on the interpretation of components clicked and dragged onto the actual, GUI itself, and then trying to figure out what's going wrong through a series of boxes and lines in some sort of semi-low code environment. Yes, you've put a higher barrier to the entry, but I think at the end of the day, data engineers like the code, or at least in my experience, like the code. And as long as you're comfortable scripting from start to finish, then you're not going to have a problem with that lack of functionality in Glue. But it does put a barrier to entry depending on where you say your data engineers in your organization operate. Are they data engineers who are used to the SSIS Informatica type way of click and drag in boxes? Then Glue's not at the same level as that yet, but I suspect it's coming. Look at the changes that have happened over the last 18 months compared to Azure. But where it is ahead, I feel, is the ability just to go in and submit pure code at a Spark cluster without having to worry about the infrastructure.
Yep. Yeah, going back to the what we like about it, right? That ability to run Spark code very easily. It's a single point, but it's a massive one.
Yeah.
What else don't we? What are some else in the bad column here for Glue? Anything else come to mind?
Yeah. So the local dev problem is something that constantly comes up. Local development problem. I have the last year spent a month implementing a solution that, again, I sort of came up with by myself by going through different AWS documents and working out what I thought was best for the team. There's kind of a lack of like, what is best practice? So what I've kind of found in many organizations is that Glue gives you the ability to code in the console if you want, be that on the click and drag or straight script. But as we've mentioned, there's no kind of source control, there's no CI/CD, and no organization really wants people just typing random code into an actual like physical console on a web, selecting a job, and then persisting at the S3, and that's your entire code base in S3. Like with no source control. It's just not best practice from an organizational point of view. So then this is where we get into the cross-account and CI/CD. And the next thing that always comes is, well, how do I actually then develop code to run against development if I'm not going to develop it in the Glue console on the web itself? And this opens up a world of possibilities, but in my opinion, nothing is particularly straightforward compared to something like Azure. So I, for AWS, most recently would create code, infrastructure as code that spins up a thing called a Glue Dev Endpoint. The Glue Dev Endpoint is basically an abstracted cluster array that provides a way to SSH in. Using a key pair, a developer can then SSH in from a local IDE. It used to be PyCharm only, but now Visual Studio Code, the wonderful Visual Studio Code, also has this functionality. So you can set this up with a developer, and it's not simple. It would take someone who has in-depth infrastructure knowledge to do this, because I've had to do it for 5 developers who've joined the team in the last year. But it is a set and forget thing, as long as you kind of do a bit more DNS trickery in behind, where essentially your infrastructure is code. When you spin up and down your cluster and change the IP, actually change the DNS record, and then you're always going to www.something that is the same, so you can do a set and forget. So as you can already say on a podcast, this is quite a lot of in-depth setup to configure a local IDE. But what it gives the ability is the developer then to code locally, hit the run command or whatever way they want to run, usually in their local IDE, debug, and it submits that code straight at that Glue cluster. And that Glue cluster then has access to your Glue data catalog that then has all your catalog information in dev. So at that point, the developer really isn't aware that their code's not running locally, other than their laptop's not spinning at 90 miles an hour because you're trying to run a terabit of data through it. It sends it up, gives you instant feedback on the console like you normally would, print statements, log statements, and then you can start developing from there. But that is an in-depth process to set up. And the second thing is the cost. Dev Endpoint running 5 nodes, you're looking at about $60 a day. And that's enough to kind of put 3 developers on, looking at kind of like smallish gigabits worth of data in development if they're all there on once. So that is a bit of a cost, but without that instant feedback loop of developing locally, you're into a process where you need to take your code, commit your code to your source control, push that code up into Glue, create a Glue job itself, and then run that with a cold start. So you could be looking at almost anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes just to test a small change in your code base otherwise in development. And Bob, is this a problem that you've been having as well, or a gripe?
Yeah, I remember reaching out to you and asking you this question about local development, and I knew that you were doing the endpoint approach, and that is very, very slick. I do like that aspect of some of the things that you highlighted. A couple of things I did not like was some of the things you also highlighted was the setting it up seemed to be pretty lengthy. At that time, earlier this year, it was only supported by PyCharm Professional. Sounds like they've expanded that. So that might be another reason to give it another look. And the other thing was the cost as well. And after looking at a couple things I came across in AWS world, I went down the Docker approach, right? So that's kind of how I am setting up a local dev environment, is the use of Docker. And the official AWS Glue lib container that has everything kind of installed, pre-built, and I'm able to use Visual Code and some of the, I believe it's the Remote Explorer extension that allows me to connect to this and essentially do my unit testing, but also to run anything that has some Glue imports, things like that. Not a full featured thing, is not as full featured as it sounds like the endpoint is, but it is enough that it does satisfy that ability to say, hey, I want to test this out without going through a complete commit, roll S3, start it up, have a cold start and figure out that, hey, I have a problem, I have a syntax error, something like that. So yeah, not a perfect case. I think this is something that, definitely belongs in the things could be better in the Glue world, both in documentations and some options. But there are, I think, between the endpoint and the Docker container, some pretty solid options there. Once you get them set up, they work pretty well.
Yeah, I think so. Although I kind of said like you're talking $50-$60 a day for Glue Dev Endpoint. Realistically, your engineers are going to be operating at 8 hours a day. So where most of the time for me of setting up a Glue Dev Endpoint is setting up its infrastructure as code, so it'll kill itself after the end of the working day if someone's left it up, and then putting it in for a one-click deploy for an engineer, not relying on a DevOps team, because you don't want that reliance. You want that to kind of set and forget. Engineer comes in the morning, I need to do Glue work, hits a button in the Git repository on production, and it spins up the endpoint for him so he can use it all day. He also has the ability then to tear it down, and if they forget, then it will automatically tear down at night, saving you costs. So you're looking at $20 a day. And considering Glue and the Glue lib and the actual ETL engine and all that software is technically free, you're only paying for the compute for it to run. If you compare that to another ETL tool where you might be paying like a software licensing cost plus a server to host it on, then it's going to work out just as cheap, not cheaper. I think some people go to the cloud and they're like, Glue's a free ETL engine. And then you say, well, actually, you're going to pay $10 a day if you want a local environment set up with the Dev Endpoint to actually make your data engineers productive. It's going to cost you a few thousand a year. They kind of take a step back. But if you then compare that to a more traditional software licensing kind of structure, it's still cheaper.
Yep, exactly. I think it's also worth noting, particularly with the endpoint, if you're a fan of notebooks and you like to, hey, I need to work out a function or, for some of the things you typically go inside a notebook to do. I know the notebook is a very popular tool in the data science world, but sometimes it's helpful in the data engineering world to work out a couple things. You can hook up a notebook instance to your endpoint pretty easily, but probably much easier than you can an IDE, I would say. And then also on the internet, on the notebook front, you can use, I think it's still in preview, but it's the interactive sessions that they announced maybe last year. Hopefully that's generally available soon. And that allows you to submit requests to the Spark cluster in Glue from your local notebook. So that might be helpful and might be a little cheaper overall than using Dev Endpoint. But it's interesting to see how they'll shake out. All right. Anything else in the bad column?
Yeah, I mean, just another point on costs, especially with people who are new to kind of the big data ecosystem, enter Spark kind of environment, and they think a job's slow, and the next thing they start doing is upping what Glue called DPU units, which is data processing units, which is essentially how much memory, disk, and at the end of the day, nodes are assigned to your abstracted cluster. And I've had cases recently where rather than kind of looking at the overall code and working out, is there a problem with the way my code is wrote, the first thing they do is, well, sure, we'll just up the DPU units by 100. I think the max is currently somewhere around 300 or something, but you are paying for those DPU units over $1 per hour. And if you've got a long running job and someone's went rogue on the DPU units, it can get expensive quite quickly, especially if multiple developers working up there. Whilst if you are working on a more traditional infrastructure where you have a finite amount of actual memory on your servers because you own those servers, then that's not going to happen from a cost control perspective. They may bring down your cluster. Those jobs may bring down the cluster, but they're not going to run for 6 hours and cost your organization thousands of dollars. Which again, although I'm saying that's a bad thing, sometimes that's a good thing because you might want that elasticity when you need a bigger job without having to purchase more hardware. But with great power comes great responsibility sometimes is kind of the best way to phrase that.
Yeah, it can get pretty pricey pretty quick. I think that's, excuse me, also worth noting, and maybe I should have mentioned this in the good section, but I like the ability to use Python shell jobs. You can use a fraction of a DPU. So if you have something that, I don't know, maybe you're orchestrating some SQL statements on a database, perhaps, and it doesn't require a lot of DPU or compute on the Glue side, maybe look at Python shell job as opposed to a PySpark or a Scala. So it might be a cheaper way there to avoid some cost.
Yeah, and just on that kind of Python thing, some people ask me is, well, why don't you use a Lambda function for that with this extended runtime? Or why don't you have some sort of container-based system to run those jobs like in the old days or even just on a server? And Wes, they kind of said to him, yeah, they are all possibilities, but sometimes less is more, where if you're especially in a growing organization or a startup, or you want to keep things in a simple manner, having a one-stop shop where you can run your Python jobs and then orchestrate them from there as well makes the whole development and operational side of your business easier. It's not like you're running 6 tools to do 6 different things. You can actually just bring it all into one centralized place, and that makes it easier to scale, maintain, and actually optimize as well.
Agreed. You know, I got a couple items here left in the areas of improvement. Well, maybe I'll say that more than what's bad. So I like the areas for improvement. Right? I would like to see maybe some better ways to handle incremental jobs, right? Those Delta jobs. I know there's bookmarks. Those are for what's new, right? And they particularly work better for an S3 scenarios for dropping. What are the new files in S3? Also, you have the ability to use that feature in JDBC, so JDB sources like databases, of course. But I think there's limited features there. You have to have potentially an ID. It doesn't work off timestamps. There's some limited features there. I'd like to see some improvements in that area to make incremental jobs a little easier to work with. I think there's some opportunities there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think what's interesting with AWS is that they've listened to customers and started to look at incremental big data solutions elsewhere outside of Glue. So EMR now supports Hoodie. Is now, I think EMR 6 definitely supports it. So that's sitting there to be done where you're capturing CDC, and then using that, you can actually start to do more interesting things with your jobs, especially around bookmarking and high watermarks. And then the same thing stands for AWS governed tables and AWS lake formation. But it just feels like at the minute, AWS Glue is kind of lagging behind that slightly, that they haven't almost caught up to where they need to be.
Yeah, I definitely would echo that sentiment. What about when it comes to orchestrating these jobs, right? What have you done? What works well for you?
So I think this is where it gets kind of interesting, because there's the inbuilt Glue scheduler, which is as simple as running one Glue job, or you could go into something like AWS Glue workflows that lets you pair or build multi-jobs together. However, from my experience, companies usually have some sort of scheduler they prefer to use from the get-go, or they might be running multiple systems outside of Glue that need kind of put together in some sort of workflow. And by that, I mean, like, it could come from some code running on a server, an API call, then a Lambda function, then it lands somewhere, and then Glue runs. You want to kind of orchestrate that all together. And from my experience with that, I've been implementing Apache Airflow, mainly as the orchestrator. It's very simple. It's got a Glue libraries out of the box. You provide it. If you run it inside your AWS account, it actually can lift keys for you straight out of the box. And then all you're doing is running their jobs that way and scheduling them with DAGs. I do get asked the question a lot, why not just use workflows, especially if you're running a lot of Glue jobs? And the only reason, as I said there, that I haven't been running them especially in production, is because there's always some sort of pre-step outside the Glue that needs done at the moment. And for me then, well, I might as well just have one scheduling tool, which might as well be Airflow, kind of being the leader in the field. And therefore, Airflow becomes the scheduling tool for everything that I'm building inside the engineering environment.
And I guess that I think you're using the managed instance that's available on AWS. So that doesn't hurt either, right? That's one less headache that you don't have to deal with if you're using a managed orchestration tool. Yeah,
so it's a managed service. It is a one-stop shop again. You need to configure a few things, but it does spin up a VPC. It does spin up private endpoints. It spins up a couple of servers. It installs Airflow on those servers. And then your networking is then in place from the get-go to kind of communicate with everything on the way out. Or it may be a little simple change to a write table at that point. But it's a lot easier than saying, I have Airflow and I want to place this onto an EC2 box myself and start trying to configure it, because the other solution that they kind of provide has redundancy out of the box. So a couple of things to kind of click around with, or code in your infrastructure as code, and then you're kind of ready to go from there with managed workflows.
Nice. And throw in some input here. We did look at, on this project, evaluating between Airflow and workflows. We chose to start with workflows to see how far we could get with that. It seems to do everything that we needed to do in terms of stitching jobs together, being able to share information between those jobs. Obviously, you can schedule them, through the use of triggers. It has some basic workflow type stuff. If I have a failure in one job, I can start from there. I don't have to go back to the beginning. I can rerun a particular job, even if there isn't a failure. All the logging. It's worked out pretty well so far. But again, we've kind of bookmarked that thought process that, hey, down the road, we might have to go to Airflow, especially if we have to orchestrate things outside of the Glue environment, much like you noted. But so far, so good with workflow.
Yeah,
I should have put that in the good category as well.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, she said, this is an opportunity thing where are AWS going to create their own scheduler inside AWS at some point that spans multi-services that they provide? I think that's really the question posed. Or will they always just point to managed workflows for now with Airflow and say, look, yep, though this is an open source third-party tool, we're going to maintain the AWS libraries and you can go there. I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do over the next couple of years, because it is definitely getting to the point where organizations are using multi-services to do their data engineering inside AWS and do need to orchestrate them as well somehow across multiple services.
I know they're really pushing step functions for the orchestration, maybe more so on the app world, right, of those workflows of like signing up a new customer, right? Working through the Lambda functions and other various services that you might encounter more so on the app world. Definitely step functions are being pushed.
Yeah, one of the organizations I was working with 18 months ago, we're using step functions to do ad hoc EMR processing, which sounds a bit of an oxymoron statement, but what it was a self-service platform where a business user could come in, submit a CSV, obviously. It went through some pre-checks, like does it have a header? Was there any rogue rows? Was it delimitered, flying around that shouldn't have been? Passed all those checks, put it in the step function, that was the first part. Step function then went on to spin up an EMR cluster. It then accepted that CSV file into the EMR cluster, ran some Python code to create an ETL script that would take that CSV file and turn it into Parquet, and then write that down to a destination based on the file's name inside the S3 data lake in the kind of second zone of silver. And the original S3 then went down into the bronze zone as another step. And then obviously a completion step to inform the user that it happened with an SNS message out, I think, or an SES message out saying your job has been complete. Your data is now available inside the data lake in this table. And that's a really good use of step functions where you kind of ad hocly do something like that as a one-off ingest for a business user. Personally, I've been in companies where the ETL is, I hate to use the word complex ETL, but I think it always ends up complex in terms of volume, not necessarily in terms of what is happening in terms of like actual individual jobs, but companies can have thousands and thousands and thousands of workflows running on a daily basis with interdependencies between them. And that's where, although step functions is being pushed for that kind of event driven, I think there's a need for something more traditional in terms of orchestration across the platform outside of step functions.
Yeah, interesting. Do you have any, does EventBridge fill any of those gaps? Can you speak to any of that?
So the only times I saw EventBridge being used recently is where they've been ingesting data from third-party sources, SaaS software, usually something like Business Objects or Salesforce. But again, in event drives from the other side, like when something happens inside Salesforce, it takes that and lifts that into an S3 bucket. And then if you're event-driven at that stage, then there's a trigger on the S3 bucket that does something. And that trigger was scheduled then back inside workflows or inside Airflow, or you could use a step function at that point. But again, now we're piecing like 2 or 3 services together again, and there's no one-stop shop for that kind of like overarching view. And this is probably where there's going to be a pile of comments going, "You idiot, you can do it this way and you're not doing it right."
We're getting possibly off the path here.
Yeah, possibly true, but that's my experience anyway. And I'm open for someone to point out that there's an easy way to orchestrate the multiple systems or services together inside AWS. Something serverless, I think, is really what I'm trying to maybe hint at, because managed Airflow still isn't serverless. Like, it is still when you spin it up, and it does create VPCs and subnets, or you can place it inside your own VPCs and subnets, and it does create servers that you can see, and then you are actually going in through a server on a web browser. Something which is like, here's our ETL, one-stop shop orchestration systems for any jobs you want to do, even like spinning up EC2s and running bash commands across them, that kind of thing, you know, which right now sits outside there again in Systems Manager. But you could orchestrate Systems Manager through Airflow, but now you're hopping through 3 services again to do one thing. So yeah, something I think for improvement, or at least better guidance maybe. I think that's sometimes the problem with AWS. There's 10 ways to do something and everyone has an opinion on it. It'd be great to be like, this is best way to do it for this situation. This is best way for this problem to mean. This is the best way for that problem to mean. This is what this customer's doing, and this is what that customer's doing. Yep.
That's I guess at the high level, that's some of the good and some of the bad with AWS, right? That they certainly have a number of services to accomplish whatever you want to accomplish, but maybe a little lean on, or it's not readily apparent, which you should go with, which scenario, which maybe with maybe like GCP, maybe that's a little different. Maybe they have a little bit more of an opinionated stack, and like, hey, you will do it this way if you have this problem.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because the CTOs I work with and chat with, they're kind of like, GCP has, or in their opinions anyway, is more of a finalized solution. It's present your data into BigQuery, query your data, pay for it. And they say, and it's a one-stop shop, and this is how it works. And they were like, well, how would you do the same thing in AWS? And I go, there's at least 5 ways I can think of off the top of my head to give you some form of SQL syntax that queries a large volume of data inside AWS, which could be everything from ETLing through Glue into S3 and running Athena over the top of it, to using an EMR cluster to store data in S3 and run a Hue interface using Hive over it. We've Redshift Spectrum as well that we could place over the top of it. You could put it into Redshift. You could use Glue to get it into Redshift. You could use data pipes, used to be a thing, pipeline to get it into Redshift. You could use a Lambda function to get it into Redshift. You could use your own containers to get it into Redshift. And like, that's me just starting on the different possibilities of what you could do, which is the blessing of AWS, where you want to build a solution, you can build any solution you want. When I talk to other CTOs, sometimes at large organizations especially, they just want something that works out of the box and will pay a premium for that.
Yeah, that's very good points. And skipping ahead a little bit, I had this question bookmarked a little further down, but I think it fits well with what we just discussed. And this is with the multiple ways to do things with AWS, that EMR serverless was announced last year, right? So this idea that they have a very popular, well-established product called EMR. It's a managed service. It takes away a lot of the headaches that deal with a distributed system setup and maintaining that system. But now there's EMR serverless, right? And on the face, you're like, wow, that that kind of sounds like some of the work that you could be doing through, serverless ETL development in Glue, right? It's still in, well, I think, no, it went GA in maybe 3 regions, right? So it's starting to come on the scene. Do you have any opinions about EMR serverless and how it fits in with Glue and the rest of the AWS world?
Yeah, so I was talking to my senior data engineers the other day, and their exact phrase was, so one of the guys that I work with quite closely, he's been, with AWS and EMR almost from day one. It was a revelation to get off on-premise and then he's been working with me in my most recent kind of projects, and we've implemented Glue for the last year from scratch. And he is on the same page of us. What is great about Glue? Where's the opportunities in Glue, and where the bugbears are in Glue? But we're all pretty much on the same page. And then EMR serverless comes along, and he messaged me straight away when it was announced and went, "Where does this fit in and everything? Where does this actually now fit in?" And I had to reply, and I was like, I'm not 100% sure yet. I've been messing around in it, and I see the benefits, especially for notebook users who want to just hook into an EMR cluster and be able to run some PySpark across it, do some ETL, and then maybe just want to run like Presto without having to leave the notebook. You've got all those options in there now where you can actually write SQL syntax against that data. Does it spell the end of Glue? I don't think so. Personally, I think Glue has a lot more functionality in terms of ETL out of the box. But where I do possibly see Glue going now is more down the Azure route of Glue Studio, where we're trying to make some sort of IDE one-stop shop in the cloud, because I think that's what customer bases are calling out for from Glue. They're saying, we look at Azure and it's got this amazing GUI where we can log people in, graduate straight in, and it's easy for them to get started, and we can run our ETL jobs and we can do them at scale and everything works. And I think AWS have went, there's a gap in the market. Let's build Glue Studio, because that's why Glue Studio must exist. It has to exist for that reason. And does EMR service possibly see then AWS making more of a push towards Azure with Glue and Glue Studio, and then EMR serverless coming up behind and picking up what me and you almost use Glue for today, looking after those kind of more scripty type jobs and saying, okay, that may spell the end of us being able to run just big code blocks or the full script at Glue. It may not. I don't think it will ever go, but they'll go, hey, EMR serverless is actually more for you, because by the time you're running those big code blocks, you know what you're doing inside Spark. You might as well be using EMR serverless, because the benefit of Glue is starting to actually subside at that point. Don't know what your kind of thoughts are there.
Absolutely ditto. Everything you just said. I think that's, I would not be surprised if, 3 to 5 years from now, it's very apparent that Glue is a product for the analyst, more drag and drop type of thing, friendlier, more of an ecosystem with cataloging, tighter integration, even more so with Athena, things like that, for data discovery, light data engineering, analytics, et cetera, and then people like you and I will be interacting more with EMR serverless. That would be my guess. Yep. Which is that may be a great thing, right? I mean, if you're developing EMR serverless and you have the opportunity to, what works with Glue and what doesn't, and be able to fix that in a whole new product and fill those gaps, sounds pretty good.
Sounds great to me as well. And I think coming from the EMR side of the house as well, that EMR's got less complex, lower barriers to entry over time. I think serverless was almost the next step for EMR anyway. If Glue started out on the right-hand side and EMR started out on the left-hand side, the two services have been coming closer and closer together over time to meet in the middle somewhere. And I think EMR serverless is possibly that one that sits in the middle of those two services now. And it allows EMR possibly to go more technical again. It doesn't have to worry as much about new people coming on board, and it allows Glue to go to that more kind of abstracted place. It lets it move away from the people who have the more in-depth infrastructure knowledge and say, we're going to cater towards, as you mentioned, the data scientists, the data engineers who want to do light engineering, the data analytics engineers who really just want to do light engineering and then start doing analytics, the Athena integration. But because it's kind of a one-stop shop at the moment, they did need to kind of do some separations or degrees of separations before they made that move. which the market is definitely crying out for, in my experience. Like definitely wants that kind of platform from AWS, looking at what Azure has to offer.
Yep. Yeah, I would 100% agree with that as well. Yeah, ADF is Azure Data Factory is very popular, primarily because of its low code, very easy to get going, and produce some pretty robust pipelines. Let's see. Yeah, let's talk about data catalog next. That's the Glue data catalog. It sounds like that definitely has some opinions, so please share.
I love it. It's my number one opinion. I think it is the greatest thing since sliced bread if you're inside AWS ecosystem. So for those who aren't kind of familiar, the majority, if not all, big data tools, the likes of your Hive, your Presto, your Spark, your MapReduce, all require you to have some sort of meta store about the data that you're moving. So if you think about this, if you're new to this kind of stuff and you know old language, if you think about it almost like tables and databases in an old kind of database, the Glue Data Catalog stores essentially what is a table. And that table is the representation of your data. That data could be stored in S3 as files such as CSV or Parquet, where your columns are the headers of the files. It keeps the location of where it is on S3, keeps the data types in each column, keeps even tagging information like is the data sensitive, who owns that data, and then it also keeps versions of the table. So if you update the table over time and you add a new column, then you always have the ability to go back, look at the old version and run the data from that period of time. It also can catalog things like more traditional Postgres, Microsoft, Oracle databases, where it essentially takes the schemas that you can run or insert yourself from those databases, store that metadata information inside the Glue Data Catalog. So when you're running a Glue job, it'll actually use that information to reach out into your server, like Microsoft SQL Server, and grab the data from there, pull it across into your Glue cluster, quote unquote, because you don't see the cluster, and then run your script for whatever you want to do. And then if you've got a downstream Postgres database that you want to send it to, you can add all your tables into the Glue Data Catalog. Contains all the metadata information, including the connections, and allows you to reach out and grab that connection, that information about the tables, and then in one swift move, insert that data into the downstream Postgres database. This really came from... Yeah, do you want to... Sorry, Bob.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, this really came from that, this was what was known as the Hive metastore originally in the big data ecosystem, which was either a MySQL or Postgres database that stored this information, columns, tables, data location. AWS have took this and abstracted it into a Glue Data Catalog. The only confusing thing I find with talking to business folks, CTOs, CDOs, CEOs, is that they think it's some sort of business data catalog. It is not a Calibra or anything of that nature that's going to store business definitions and kind of like master data. It's really a technical catalog that contains metadata information about your data, where it is lying at that point in time, and what format it's in.
Yeah, that's actually one of the points I was going to talk about. Yeah, if you're thinking this is going to be a full-fledged data catalog, you're used to something like Calibra or maybe Elation, think again. It's very much bare bones, like as Johnny described it, but also can be very helpful. Particularly, I like the versioning aspect of the tables. That can be pretty handy if you're looking to do any kind of drift detection, some things around that, or potentially even schema evolution. That could come in handy. And then also having those types defined, whether it's via crawler or crawler then you correcting them, that could bypass any nasty inference problems that you could get if you're just saying, go ahead, Spark data frame, infer this schema for me, and find out that it's not, it's treating something as a string and you prefer it to be numeric or vice versa, things of that nature.
Yeah, and you can create, as well as using crawlers, like you were saying, in the organizations I've been in, we usually create it through code, the tables ourselves, to stop that happening. So most recently, I've been doing it through Terraform, but you can do it through CloudFormation. You could do it through direct commands, or alternatively, you can actually write DDL and submit that through Presto, which can be Athena as well. So you can actually use Athena to create tables that ends up in your Glue Data Catalog. And I think that's then raises the best point about the Glue data catalog. It's serverless, and it works with all the other AWS services that would, big data services that in other ecosystems would need a Hive metadata catalog. So this would actually work with Athena out of the box. You can hook it into EMR out of the box. It hooks into SageMaker out of the box. It hooks into Glue out of the box. And I'm pretty sure there's about 3 or 4 other things off the top of my head that I forgot that it also goes into straight away. And from there, then you've got this metadata catalog being shared around your entire AWS ecosystem, whatever that looks like. It also can be shared cross account as well. If you only want to have one of them in your organization, you can have one in your entire organization.
Yeah, interesting. I think I may need to take a harder look at the Glue data catalog for some of the things that I've got going on. Yeah, and I don't know what you mentioned that you're populating these catalogs. Maybe you mentioned Terraform, not the crawler. The promise of the crawler seems awesome, right? That this idea that you could just say, hey, fire off these crawlers, configure light configuration, mean like, hey, go search this data source, whether it's an S3 bucket or a JDBC source, and it'll arrive at, hey, here's every table and its corresponding SQL, and it'll go ahead and auto-populate it. But honestly, when I've used it in the past, I've had mixed results. Yeah, but I guess I should take another look at that. I don't know. Do you have any opinions on the effectiveness of crawlers in this scenario?
So the only time I trust the crawler is when it is a JDBC connection into some sort of relational database, because it's effectively crawling the schema that sits there. So I've never had any problems with the crawler on Microsoft, and I've never had any problems with the crawler on Postgres. Never ran one on Oracle, so I can't speak. Never had any issues.
Gotcha.
Where crawlers start to go AWOL for me is when you're doing data on S3. So if you've ever been to an AWS immersion day where they run and you follow along, they're fantastic learning resources, and they're actually all available free online if you want to go try and do one yourself, or they run them alternatively. It's always kind of like the best case scenario where the crawler runs and it's running on S3 data, and it's magically managed to pick up the 5 tables that were sitting there under 5 CSVs with the perfect schema and the perfect data type, almost like it was engineered for this kind of perfect day in your AWS immersion day. When you go and try this yourself, there are so many nuances, because the crawler is essentially an ML algorithm that's running to try and infer schemas about your data. If it's not set up in an exact format with folders, subfolders, populated with headers correctly and delimited, it will bring back some nonsense, and I don't trust it. So from that point of view, then I do operate then the tables through code for anything on S3. As I said, most recently it's been Terraform, but before we've just done it through straight DDL, HiveQL language, where the HQL is actually ran on Athena. You still get all the glory of the data catalog, but all you're doing is like a more traditional database where you're going create table in a SQL statement and giving yourself that control then at that point in time, and you still get all the benefits of the Glue data catalog. But yeah, I agree. Crawlers promise to be this kind of one-stop shop to solve all your problems and all your writing of endless DDL code, and in my experience, they're just not there for what you would see as your kind of like less standard data, or kind of your kind of middle of the road data out. If it's very standardized data in a really standard format like Parquet that has a schema in the file, a crawler will work. But as soon as you start adding multiple folders, multiple tables, multiple files, it does become less reliable as you go along. Yeah.
And it is a tough problem to solve as well. This idea that, inferring schema is not exactly the easiest thing. So it sounds like the crawlers will honor a schema if one's available. It'll take a best guess when it isn't, and sometimes its best guess is not as great as it can be. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, it is hard though, as you said. Like it is hard. It's a hard problem to solve. It definitely solves a lot of the kind of getting started issues. It will definitely help you if your data is simple. Don't worry about it. If you're starting with one CSV file, a crawler is going to work perfect for you. If you're, a data scientist and you know exactly what you're doing, you're going to be fine in one folder. It's kind of like when you're in a bigger environment and you've got 100 folders in S3 and there's 120 tables in those folders and they all look different. Crawlers just will start to struggle at that point, in my experience.
Yeah, it's a great marketing feature, right? It's a nice marketing bullet. When you describe Glue and you come across the crawler section of that description and you say, well, this thing will crawl all your data and then automatically populate a catalog. Are you kidding me? That sounds awesome. But then, yeah, as we just discussed, is not without peril. Why don't we close things out with any kind of SME wish list things that we have for Glue? So if you were the product manager at AWS and you would say, hey, this is what I think we should be releasing in the next 3 to 5 years. Yeah. Or long up to 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I think number one thing is documentation. I think with Glue, I mean, how long have we been going? 55 minutes, and we've scratched the high surface without going into detail. There are lots of different functionality in there and lots of different ways to do the same thing. And I think documentation around best practice, or what AWS views best practice, would be very helpful. Even different examples to do those different things, because right now with the documentation, I find, yes, as a more skilled engineer or with someone with over a decade of experience, you can piece that together. But once, and definitely with my YouTube channel, people reach out to me all the time. Once you get over that kind of like initiation of Glue of here's all the basics, here's an introduction course, getting to the next stage is tricky for people. The documentation doesn't quite hold your hand enough, and there isn't enough resources out there to take people. And it needs people like me and you, Bob, with experience in other services to come in, build things, and then chat back to the community. And I just think there's a bit of a gap there right now around documentation, best practice, and maybe holding people's hands through that kind of like beginner happy path initial setup and getting them to that kind of production ready environment.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said. And, you know, I think some of the things that we mentioned in the areas of improvement could be brought up again, but no sense of belaboring those points. I think that's a good note to end on. And yeah, more guidance, right? More best practices. How do we do things and disseminate that information out to people who are trying to use Glue, right? A strong community and a well-informed community can really help a product grow and user adoption. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on again, Johnny. I really do appreciate it. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Been an absolute pleasure, Bob. And just one last plug for myself. The most viewed video at the moment is my AWS Glue video on my YouTube channel. I think it has well over 20,000 views in the last month. So if anyone's kind of new to Glue and wants a place to start, that video is sitting there with all the resources freely available if you just want to dive in and see what it's like.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't recommend Johnny's channel enough. It'll be in the notes description in the video and, of course, in the notes description of the audio as well. But check it out. He's got a lot of great content on Glue and various other AWS things. And then a couple other things that he's got going on. So excellent. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe and all that good stuff. And until the next time, see you later.